Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Tyler Brown for another of his Byzantine tangents, and today I'm going to talk about Julian the Apostate. For those of you where the term apostate doesn't mean anything, I'll tell you that that is someone who grew up in the Christian church, was part of it, and then left. This is as opposed to a heretic, who is someone who claims to be part of the Christian tradition still, but has unorthodox beliefs or doesn't line up with the mainstream. An apostate is someone who has left the church entirely. And Julian stands out for being one of the only Roman emperors to have done that. Even more so because he was Constantine's nephew. Julian started out his life born in 331 as the nephew of Constantine, who had a pretty large family. He had a lot of extended relatives, built himself up as an emperor. And then in the year 337, when Constantine died of what was probably natural causes, there was a bit of a purge. Unlike most political purges, which were usually launched top-down by some major figure or other, this purge appears to have been a bottom-up affair, where the soldiers as a whole, believing the conspiracy theories that Constantine was poisoned by a family member, just wiped out most of his family. Not his sons. Constantine had 3 sons and they were all safe, but all of his extended nieces and nephews and other relatives, they just got massacred by the army, apparently on their own initiative. There was no mastermind as far as we can tell here. And of that extended family, the only noteworthy survivors were Constantine's very young nephews, Julian and his half-brother Gallus, both of whom were about 6 at this point. So Julian had that hanging over him as he was growing up. Now, Constantine, again, had 3 sons, and to show you what kind of man Constantine was, his 3 sons' names were Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius. We're not going to dwell on those 3. We're just going to focus on Constantius II, the second being after Constantius I, Constantine's dad. Constantius is the one we're going to follow simply because his power base was in the east. He outlasts the other 2 brothers and is the main person Julian has to deal with growing up. Now, Constantius's policies were an extension of his dad's. He was very much centralizing the government around the position of emperor, trying to make a very elaborate court, elevate the position of emperor so as to get away from the days of the 3rd century crisis, where emperors were just whichever general managed to get an army that was even halfway successful. Constantius was following the tradition of his father Constantine and his predecessor Diocletian in trying to elevate the position of emperor, build a bigger court, have more courtiers, have more expenses and more lavish parties and the like. All of that to essentially put the position of emperor out of reach of any given ambitious general who's halfway competent. And this meant that Constantius was very big on raising taxes and finding various means of making quick money, usually by confiscating the property of people that he claimed were treasonous. Among the people that Constantius confiscated funds for were the decurion class in the cities, the guys who were essentially middle management, the ones in charge of each individual city, the local notables who were tasked with managing it. Constantius tended to undermine those and take away their other sources of revenue for his own purposes, and this meant that the cities were facing a bit of a financial problem. Constantius also had a bit of a confused religious policy, a bit like his dad in that regard. Even though his father Constantine held the first ecumenical council and overcame the first major heretical movement, Arianism, Constantius was actually rather sympathetic towards Arianism, and at the very least was not interested in holding up the Nicene Creed over and above any Arians. And this meant that there wasn't a lot of religious unity under his watch, and a lot of the bishops of one stance or another tended to fight each other. Constantius ended up exiling quite a few bishops over this, in an attempt to keep the peace in the religious sphere. It didn't work quite the way he wanted. Meanwhile, Julian was growing up in this environment, and he was receiving a classical Greek education, going through the liberal arts and the like. And the thing is, A lot of Christians in the early period had a wariness towards a traditional classical education because a lot of pagan writings were used in that education, at least partially just to get a sense of good writing, good style, and the like. You read your Homer, you read your Thucydides, and there was a certain Christian wariness towards this sort of thing. The idea being that young Christians who get this sort of education will have a tendency towards paganism, compromise with paganism. And on the whole, this fear was overblown. A lot of Christians managed to get through this education and keep their faith just fine. And at worst, they were compromising with the world in the sense of being mercenary and using their education for the practical purposes of making money, using their rhetorical skills to teach politicians and the like. I bring all this up because Julian was essentially the worst case scenario for their fears, because this young man, growing up with that classical education, went from being a Christian to being an ardent pagan. He picked up a Neoplatonic philosophical viewpoint, and not just in the refined sense that a lot of Neoplatonic philosophers were having at the time, where they had this monotheistic worldview and thus could get along with Christians. No, Julian was a pagan revivalist. He wanted to turn back the clock and bring back all of the pagan temples, bring back all the sacrifices, and essentially act as if all of Constantine and Constantius's reforms towards Christianity had never happened. Now, Julian kept his opinions to himself for quite a while. Constantius, despite his confused religious policy, was still leaning towards Christianity. He canceled the government funds to the pagan temples and passed several laws against pagan practices. So Julian kept his pagan views to himself for most of his life. Around the 350s, Julian suddenly found himself part of the political scene. About a year or two prior, Constantius, who had spent all of his time in the eastern part of the empire dealing with the various Persian invasions, needed a junior emperor out west, and he asked his nephew Gallus, Julian's half-brother, to fulfill that role for him. And Gallus started out as being in charge of the city of Antioch. And Gallus proved himself to be a rather tyrannical sort. Lots of corruption, lots of unjust killings, including some assassinations under his watch. And it actually got so bad that Constantius invited Gallus over to his place to talk about his behavior. And when Gallus showed up, Constantius just killed him. Just invited him over and killed him. But this did not solve Constantius's problem that he needed a junior emperor in the places he wasn't, so he asked his other nephew Julian to do it. So in the year 355, Julian found himself to be Caesar of the West, in charge of an army out in Gaul to prevent various Germanic invasions. And by Julian's own account, he did well at this. His skills with the army were noteworthy. He managed to drive back any invasions that came his way. This situation lasted for a while, but Julian was always uncomfortable with his position. Constantius was a bit of a paranoid sort, and given what happened to Julian's half-brother, Julian knew that his position as junior emperor was not particularly secure. So what happened around the year 360 is, well, in Julian's own words, he claimed that his soldiers spontaneously declared him Augustus of the West, equal to Constantius. Now, supposedly, this was in response to Constantius asking for Julian to come help him and take his army out east to fight the Persians, when most of the soldiers didn't want to do that, so they spontaneously declared Julian equal emperor of the West so they wouldn't have to do that. And Julian just was swept up in it. He couldn't help himself, like it was a done deal. Evidence suggests that Julian did in fact stage manage this, but it is entirely possible that his ambitions consisted solely of becoming an equal to Constantius so that he would have his own power base and thus not fear Constantius trying to kill him later. But tensions were going to rise after that. Constantius was never going to allow an equal, So it eventually got to the point where negotiations broke down and a civil war was launched. And this civil war is one of my favorites in Roman history. So what happens is Julian is marching east, Constantius is marching west. Their armies are getting closer to each other. And halfway there, Constantius falls sick, gets a terminal illness, and on his deathbed he just declares Julian the sole emperor. And everyone just goes along with this. There's no infighting, no purging. Julian just finds himself sole emperor after Constantius conveniently dies of illness, and that was the end of it. The most anticlimactic civil war in Roman history right there. So now it's the year 361. Julian finds himself the sole ruler of the Roman world, and he immediately starts a flurry of legislation. Partially this is political. He cuts back various spendings on the central government that Constantius had launched, ended a lot of his extra taxes, brought funding back to the local decurions, that sort of thing. Mostly this sort of legislation was for the sake of reversing Constantius's policies. Julian wanted to present himself as a liberator of the people, a great legislator and lawmaker, someone who set solid policy that respected the freedoms of the people. Even though the Roman state was not pervasive by modern standards and was more reactive than anything else, but Julian sure liked presenting himself as one of the greats. In fact, he literally wrote a piece of literature in which he described all of the previous Roman emperors, and pretty much all of them come across negatively, including the legendary Augustus Caesar himself. Constantine in particular comes off really badly, as if Julian is contrasting himself with Constantine in particular, saying Constantine is the worst of what a Roman emperor should be, while Julian's the best. Julian is the real Roman emperor by his own standards. And that leads to my main point, and the thing that makes Julian so noteworthy, given his short reign. Julian passed quite a few pro-pagan and anti-Christian pieces of legislation. He revived the pagan temples, gave government funds to them, rebuilt the old temples, hired a priesthood of pagans that had fallen into disrepair. He stopped government funding to Christian churches, and most noteworthy, he banned Christians from teaching the classical education, under the argument that since some of the material was pagan, Christians couldn't understand the culture very well, and therefore they had no business relaying a classical Greek education to anyone. And while some Christians would have agreed with him, a good number of educated Christians were very upset with Julian over this. At this stage, Constantine hadn't been dead that many decades. The Edict of Milan, which made Christianity legal, was only a few decades old at this point. Christianity had grown quite a bit in the Roman Empire, but it was not the absolute majority yet. So it is entirely possible that if Julian had stuck this out for a longer period, he might have been able to, if not eliminate Christianity, I don't think that was in his power, at least prevent it becoming the religion of the Roman Empire. Perhaps the relationship that Christians had under the later Arab caliphates, for example, where they're a substantial minority that gradually gets sidelined. But Julian was not able to get that far. His reign lasted less than 2 years. Julian tried doing a bit too much too fast for his own good, because on top of all of his legislation, he also attempted to invade the Persian Empire. He launched a two-pronged invasion to try to sack their capital of Ctesiphon. If not take over that, at least sack it and get good terms from the Persians. And this invasion didn't go the way he thought. He tried a two-pronged invasion, but his second army didn't show up. Julian had to retreat, and in the course of that, he got struck with a spear. There are some different legends around this. A lot of Christians afterwards claim that Saint Mercurius, a man who'd supposedly died under Julian's watch, descended from heaven and personally struck Julian down with his spear. Current consensus is that an Arab mercenary hired by the Persians snuck in and killed him. But either way, Julian got struck down. He died there. He was only in his 30s at this point. Julian had not reigned very long. He had not lived very long. And he really is one of those big what-if rulers in history, someone who could have potentially changed the course of Roman history if he had lasted longer. This, of course, leads to a lot of speculation over what he could have done, and a lot of projection onto him, because how you feel about Julian is really dictated by how you feel about the Christian church and the course they took Roman history after this, like how they intertwined with the Roman state. Because if you are inclined to look at the Roman church unfavorably, then you tend to look at Julian fairly positively, and his decisions of pushing back on Christianity were a good thing. And this is not just a modern phenomena. Various historians throughout history who are inclined to look at the Catholic Church in particular as a negative influence in the world see Julian's actions in a positive light. Those who are in support of Christianity in general, and the Catholic Church in particular, have always depicted Julian in the worst possible light, to the point where they say that he was a direct persecutor himself. As far as we can tell, he wasn't, at least not in the sense that he ordered purgings. He was more someone who was trying to undermine Christianity indirectly, cut off funding from churches, ban Christians from preaching, and a couple of other petty things. He brought back a lot of the people Constantius exiled, mostly because he knew they would stir up infighting in the churches. And he also, and I'm not making this up, he heard about the prophecy that the Jewish temple would never be rebuilt until the end times, and so Julian funded the rebuilding of the Temple Mount, the Jewish temple, solely to spite the Christians. This didn't go well. An earthquake struck the building site and the temple fell down, and possibly this was helped along by arson. It's hard to say. But if you want a sense of the kind of guy Julian was, even if he was not a direct persecutor of Christianity, he was not friendly with it at all. As you can tell from his writings, Julian is one of those interesting figures where a lot of the writings he wrote were preserved by posterity. We have them, and we have Julian's strong opinions on quite a few things. He wrote against Christianity quite a bit. He wrote against his predecessors quite a bit. But he also wrote against other people. Noteworthily, he condemned a poet and playwright who was a follower of the Cynic philosophy, because the guy depicted himself as Zeus and Julian as Hercules, and Julian took that personally because, as a pagan revivalist, he saw this guy as blaspheming the Greek gods. Julian was a bit puritanical for the Greek gods, if such a term could be applied. He really is a fascinating figure. He's one of those cases where you can really get a sense of what this man's personality was like. This isn't true for a lot of famous figures, even Roman emperors. So, even to this day, despite his short reign, he stands out as a fascinating character in the course of Roman history. Thank you all for coming here and watching. If you liked what you heard, please like and subscribe to support the channel. I would really appreciate that. And have a good day.